The cabin looked like it was being swallowed by winter. That's what the neighbors said when they saw what Lars Eriksson was doing in the fall of 1889. While every other settler in northern Minnesota was shoveling snow away from their cabins, keeping their walls clear, maintaining pathways, Lars was doing the opposite. He was piling snow against his walls, deliberately, systematically, building it up like he was trying to bury his own house. They called him Snow-Mad Lars. They said the isolation had gotten to him. They said he'd lost his mind during his first brutal winter alone and was now trying to freeze himself to death in some strange Scandinavian ritual. Some suggested he was building his own tomb. Others just shook their heads and muttered about foreigners who didn't understand how things were done in America. Lars Eriksson just kept working, shovel after shovel of snow, packed carefully against his cabin walls, building it up 3 feet high, then 4 feet, then 5, creating a thick white barrier between his log walls and the killing cold of a Minnesota winter. His neighbors watched from a distance, convinced they were witnessing a slow suicide. They didn't understand what Lars knew, what he'd learned from the Sami herders in the far north of Norway, what indigenous peoples across the Arctic had known for thousands of years. That snow, properly used, wasn't the enemy of warmth. Snow was the ally. Snow was insulation. Snow was survival. Then January of 1890 arrived, the coldest month in Minnesota history. 4 weeks when the temperature never rose above zero, when nights dropped to 40 below and stayed there, when the wind screamed across the frozen lakes at 50 miles per hour, when firewood supplies ran critically low and families faced the real possibility of freezing in their own homes. In cabins across the settlement, people burned wood desperately. They stuffed every crack with rags and paper. They huddled by their fireplaces, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. And still the cold penetrated. Still the frost crept across their interior walls. Still their water buckets froze solid 3 feet from the fire. In Lars Eriksson's snow-covered cabin, the temperature held steady at 55 degrees. With a fire so small his neighbors would have considered it decorative. With firewood consumption, that was a fraction of theirs. With comfort, they couldn't imagine. The cabin they'd mocked, the one buried in snow like an igloo, was 18 degrees warmer inside than the log cabins around it. 18 degrees that meant the difference between survival and suffering. 18 degrees that proved everything the neighbors believed about fighting winter was wrong. This is the story of how ancient Arctic knowledge saved lives in the Minnesota frontier. How a technique so simple it seemed insane outperformed every conventional building method, and how the man they called crazy became the man who changed how people survived in the deep cold. Lars Eriksson was born in 1858 in Tromsø, Norway, far above the Arctic Circle. His father was a fisherman, his mother the daughter of Sami reindeer herders. He grew up in a world where winter wasn't just a season, it was a 6-month test of preparation and knowledge, where understanding cold meant the difference between life and death. The Sami, the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, had survived Arctic winters for thousands of years. They had developed sophisticated techniques for dealing with extreme cold. Lars's maternal grandfather was Sami, and he taught Lars lessons that most Norwegian children never learned. Lessons about snow, about how it behaved, about what it could do. Snow is not solid, his grandfather explained. Snow is mostly air. Tiny ice crystals with space between them. That space, that trapped air, stops heat from moving. Snow is one of nature's best insulators, better than wood, better than stone, if you know how to use it. He showed Lars how the Sami built emergency shelters in snowbanks, how they would dig into deep snow, creating caves that were warmer inside than the outside air, even with no fire. How the snow itself provided insulation, trapping body heat and blocking wind. How a person could survive a blizzard in a snow cave that would kill them in the open. He explained that the key was understanding snow's structure. fresh, fluffy snow was best. It had the most air trapped in it. Dense, wet snow was less effective. Ice had almost no insulating value. The fluffier the snow, the more air it contained, the better it insulated. A foot of fluffy snow could provide insulation equivalent to several inches of wood. Lars learned to read snow, to understand its density, its moisture content, its insulating properties. He learned that snow on the ground was different from snow on a roof, that wind-packed snow was different from fallen snow, that each type had different properties and uses. This knowledge was as natural to him as reading the alphabet. When Lars was 28, he emigrated to America. The fishing was declining in Norway, land was scarce, America offered opportunity. He arrived in New York in 1886 with $20 and a canvas bag containing his possessions. He spoke broken English. He knew no one, but he knew cold, and he knew survival. He worked his way west, taking jobs as they came. A dock worker in New York, a logger in Wisconsin. Each job taught him something, added to his skills. By 1888, he had saved enough money to file a homestead claim. He chose northern Minnesota, not despite its harsh winters, but because of them. Other settlers feared the cold. Lars understood it. That gave him an advantage. His claim was 160 acres near the settlement of Bemidji, in a region of forests and frozen lakes. The land was good, the timber plentiful, but the winters were legendary. Old-timers talked about the winter of 1857, when 3 trappers froze to death in their cabin despite having firewood. About the winter of 1873, when entire families abandoned their claims, fleeing south to escape the cold. Lars filed his claim in April of 1888. He spent the summer building a cabin, cutting hay for insulation, and preparing for winter. His first winter was a learning experience. His cabin was standard construction, log walls, chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace, a sod roof. It worked reasonably well. He survived, but he noticed something. The cabin required constant fire, enormous amounts of firewood. He spent hours each day cutting, splitting, and hauling wood. The temperature inside fluctuated wildly based on the fire. Let it die down, and the cold rushed in within an hour. The walls, despite being thick logs, didn't seem to provide much insulation. The heat just passed through them and escaped. Lars thought about his grandfather's lessons, about snow as insulation, about trapped air. He wondered if there was a way to use snow to improve his cabin's performance. The idea seemed crazy, even to him. Snow on a cabin? Deliberately? But the principle made sense. If snow could insulate a snow cave, why couldn't it insulate a wooden cabin? He spent the summer of 1889 preparing. He modified his cabin in specific ways. He extended his roof eaves by 3 feet, creating wide overhangs. He built wooden frames around the base of his cabin, like low fences, about 6 feet from the walls. He reinforced his roof structure, adding extra supports. His neighbors watched these modifications with curiosity and confusion. "What are you building, Lars? A fort?" Lars smiled. "Preparing for winter." The neighbor, a man named George Patterson, whose claim adjoined his, shook his head. "You preparing for a war? What's all the extra structure for?" Lars tried to explain. "For snow, to hold snow." Patterson frowned. "You want snow on your cabin?" Lars nodded. "For insulation." Patterson laughed. "Snow for insulation? Snow's cold, Lars. You want to keep cold away from your cabin, not pile it on." Lars attempted to explain the principle. Snow traps air. Air stops heat from escaping. More snow, more insulation, warmer cabin. Patterson just shook his head. "That's the craziest thing I ever heard. You pile snow on your cabin, you'll just make it colder and probably collapse your roof." Lars shrugged. "We will see." By October, Lars's preparations were complete. The extended eaves would protect the upper walls from wind and would support snow on the lower roof sections. The wooden frames around the cabin base would contain packed snow, holding it against the walls. The reinforced roof could support significant snow load. Everything was ready. The first significant snow came in early November. 6 inches of light, fluffy snow. Perfect. While his neighbors shoveled their pathways and cleared snow away from their cabins, Lars did the opposite. He took his shovel and began piling snow against his cabin walls, carefully, methodically, using the wooden frames to contain it. He packed it loosely, not compressing it too much. Compressed snow was denser, with less trapped air, and therefore less insulating. He wanted it firm enough to stay in place, but fluffy enough to maintain its insulating properties. He built it up 2 feet high all around the cabin. Then he stopped and waited. George Patterson rode over the next day. He stared at the snow piled against Lars's cabin. "Lars, what in God's name are you doing? Building insulation with snow? That's insane. Snow's going to make your cabin colder, not warmer." Lars shook his head. "Snow traps air. Air is good insulator, like feathers in blanket." Patterson looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "You've lost your mind. Winter isolation got to you already, and it's only November." Word spread quickly. That Norwegian fellow, the one who keeps to himself, he's piling snow on his cabin. Says it's for insulation. Must be touched in the head. Within a week, Lars Eriksson had a new nickname. Snowmad Lars. People rode by his claim just to see the cabin with snow piled against it. They shook their heads. They laughed. Some felt sorry for him. Poor fellow going to freeze to death in his snow pile. Lars ignored them. He continued his routine. After each snowfall, he would shovel more snow against his cabin walls, building the snow barrier higher. By mid-November, it was 3 feet high. By early December, 4 feet. The cabin was starting to look buried. The snow came up past the bottoms of his windows on the north and west sides. His neighbors were convinced he'd made a fatal error. That's going to rot his logs. All that moisture against the wood. He'll have structural failure by spring. And the weight. That snow's going to push his walls in. Or the roof snow will collapse the whole thing. He's building his own coffin. But Lars understood something they didn't. The snow wasn't touching his logs directly. The wooden frames created a small air gap just a few inches between the snow and the wall. The snow barrier was separate from the structure, and he'd designed it to shed moisture. The frames had drainage at the bottom. Meltwater would run away from the foundation, not soak into it. The snow on the lower roof sections was intentional too. The extended eaves created areas where snow could accumulate safely, adding insulation to the roof without excessive weight on the main structure. Lars had calculated the load-bearing capacity. His reinforced roof could handle it. December brought more snow and colder temperatures. Lars continued building his snow barriers. By Christmas, they were 5 feet high on the north and west sides, lower on the south and east, where the winter sun was stronger. The cabin looked like a strange snow fort. The neighbors had stopped riding by. They'd seen enough. Snow-mad Lars and his crazy igloo cabin. Inside, Lars monitored the temperature carefully. He had a thermometer, a precious instrument he'd bought in Bemidji. He kept detailed notes: outside temperature, inside temperature, fire size, firewood consumption. He was testing his theory scientifically, documenting everything. What he observed fascinated him. As the snow barriers grew thicker, the cabin's thermal performance improved dramatically. With 3 feet of snow against the walls, the temperature differential between inside and outside increased. With 4 feet, it increased more. The thicker the snow barrier, the warmer the cabin stayed with less fire. He also noticed that the temperature inside was more stable. Without the snow, the cabin temperature would swing based on the fire. Roaring fire, too hot. Fire dies down, too cold. With the snow barriers, the temperature stayed remarkably constant. The snow was buffering the temperature swings, just like thermal mass in the earth cabin, but using a different mechanism. Snow's insulating properties work through trapped air. Each snowflake Each ice crystal is separated from the others by tiny air spaces. Air is a poor conductor of heat. When heat tries to move through snow, it has to transfer through air, then ice, then air, then ice, thousands of times. Each transition slows the heat transfer. The result is that heat moves very slowly through snow. A 5-foot barrier of fluffy snow provided an insulation value, an R value, equivalent to about 15 inches of fiberglass insulation. That's extraordinary. Lars's log walls alone, even well chinked, provided maybe an R value of 8 to 10. Adding 5 feet of snow increased the effective R value to 40 or 50. That's super insulated by any standard. The year turned to 1890. January arrived with temperatures that made December seem mild. The cold that came that month was legendary. On January 3rd, the temperature dropped to 30 below zero. By January 5th, it was 40 below. And it stayed there. Day after day, the thermometer barely moved. 40 below, 35 below, 42 below, week after week. The settlement of Bemidji, 20 miles from Lars's claim, saw its firewood supplies dwindle alarmingly. The cold was so severe, so prolonged, that people were burning wood 3 times faster than normal. Families that thought they had enough wood for the winter realized they'd run out by February at this rate. Panic set in. Settlers started burning furniture, fence posts, anything wooden. The general store sold out of kerosene. People were rationing food because cooking required precious fuel. Several families decided to abandon their claims, heading south to warmer regions. The winter of 1890 was breaking people. At Lars Eriksson's cabin, the situation was completely different. His thermometer told the story. Outside temperature, 41 below zero. Inside temperature, 54 degrees. The differential was 95 degrees, with a fire that could barely be called a fire. A few sticks of wood burning in the fireplace, more for light and cooking than for heat. The snow barriers were performing beyond Lars's expectations. The 5 feet of snow on the north and west walls were blocking heat loss almost completely. The snow on the roof sections was preventing heat from escaping upward. The cabin was so well insulated that Lars's own body heat, combined with a tiny fire and the heat from his oil lamp, was enough to maintain comfortable temperatures. His firewood consumption was astonishing. 1/10 of what he'd used the previous winter, 1/20 of what his neighbors were using. He had enough wood stacked to last 3 more winters at this rate. While his neighbors faced fuel crisis, Lars sat comfortably, reading books by lamplight, wearing a single wool shirt. On January 18th, George Patterson came to Lars's cabin, not to mock this time, to seek help. Patterson looked haggard, desperate. His family was out of firewood. They'd burned everything they could. He needed to borrow wood or his family would freeze. Lars gave him 2 cords from his massive stockpile. He didn't hesitate. Patterson took the wood with shaking hands, tears in his eyes. "How are you doing this, Lars? How do you have wood to spare when everyone else is out?" "I use less." How are you staying warm?" Patterson looked at the snow-covered cabin. "Is it really the snow?" Lars nodded. "Snow is insulation. Best insulation." Patterson shook his head slowly. "We all laughed at you, called you crazy. You're the only one who's not freezing." Lars shrugged. "Old knowledge, from my grandfather. From the Sami people, they know cold, they know snow." Patterson asked if he could see inside. Lars invited him in. Patterson stepped through the door and stopped dead. It was warm, genuinely comfortably warm. He looked at the tiny fire, barely more than coals. "That's it? That's your fire?" Lars nodded. "Don't need more. Snow keeps heat inside." Patterson walked to the interior wall and touched it. It was cool but not cold. He touched the exterior wall. The same. The cold wasn't penetrating. He pulled out his own thermometer. Outside it read 38 below. Inside, 55 degrees. A 93-degree difference. In his own cabin with a roaring fire, the differential was maybe 40 degrees. Lars's cabin with almost no fire was maintaining a differential twice as large. The snow insulation was that effective. Patterson stayed for an hour asking questions, trying to understand. Lars explained the principles patiently. Snow traps air. Air stops heat movement. Thick snow barrier stops heat from escaping. Simple. But it works. Patterson asked why no one else knew this. Lars smiled. People know. Indigenous peoples in Arctic, Inuit, Sami, native peoples in far north. They all know. They use snow to survive, build snow houses, igloos, very warm inside. But people here, they think snow is enemy. They fight it, clear it away. They don't understand. It can be ally. Patterson left with his borrowed firewood and a head full of new ideas. He spread the word. Lars's cabin is warm, really warm, and it's the snow. The snow's insulating it. The reaction was mixed. Some people dismissed it. Impossible. Snow can't insulate. It's cold. Others were intrigued. If Patterson says it works, maybe there's something to it. A few desperate settlers decided to try it themselves. James Holbrook, whose cabin was 3 miles from Lars's, was the first to replicate the technique. On January 20th, with temperatures still brutal, he began shoveling snow against his cabin walls. He built it up 3 feet high, copying what he'd seen at Lars's place. Within 2 days, he noticed a difference. His cabin was holding heat better. The fire didn't need to be as large. The temperature was more stable. By the end of January, 6 settlers had built snow barriers around their cabins. All reported improved thermal performance, warmer interiors, less firewood consumption, more stable temperatures. The technique worked. It actually worked. The man they'd called crazy had been right all along. February brought a slight warming. Temperatures rose into the 20s, feeling almost tropical after January's extremes. But the cold had taken its toll. 3 families had abandoned their claims, unable to cope with the fuel requirements. 2 settlers, living alone, had frozen to death when their firewood ran out. The winter of 1890 would be remembered as one of the worst in Minnesota history. Lars Eriksson had survived it comfortably. He'd barely made a dent in his firewood supply. He'd stayed warm, healthy, and productive through the coldest month anyone could remember. And he'd shared his knowledge freely, helping neighbors who'd mocked him just weeks earlier. His generosity and his vindication earned him respect that would last the rest of his life. When spring came and the snow melted, revealing the cabins underneath, Lars's logs were in perfect condition. No rot, no damage. The drainage system he'd built had worked. The air gap had prevented moisture problems. His neighbors' fears about structural damage proved unfounded. The snow had protected the cabin, not harmed it. George Patterson rebuilt his cabin that summer. He designed it with Lars's input, adding features to optimize snow insulation, extended eaves, containment frames, reinforced roof, proper drainage. When winter came again, Patterson built his snow barriers early and maintained them carefully. His firewood consumption dropped by 70% compared to his first winter. His family stayed warm and comfortable. If you're fascinated by this kind of practical survival wisdom that kept people alive in the harshest conditions, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We dig deep into forgotten techniques and knowledge that could save your life today. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. The technique spread throughout northern Minnesota over the following years. Settlers who experienced the winter of 1890 understood the value of snow insulation. They built their new cabins with features to accommodate snow barriers. Extended eaves, strong roofs, proper drainage. The snow-covered cabin became a common sight in the region. The practice evolved and improved. People learned that fresh snow worked best. That wet, heavy snow was less effective. That wind-packed snow had different properties than fallen snow. They learned optimal snow depth for different temperatures. They learned that south-facing walls needed less snow because solar gain helped warm them. They learned to create ventilation to prevent moisture buildup inside. Some settlers built permanent structures to contain the snow, wooden forms like low walls that stayed in place year-round. In fall, they'd install them around the cabin. After each snowfall, they'd fill them with snow. In spring, they'd remove the forms and the snow would melt away. The system became standardized and efficient. Lars himself continued refining the technique. In the fall of 1891, he experimented with different snow depths on different walls. 5 feet on the north wall, 4 feet on the west, 3 feet on the east, 2 feet on the south. This optimization matched the insulation to the exposure. The north wall, facing the coldest winds, got the most insulation. The south wall, receiving solar gain, needed less. He also experimented with roof snow. He found that a 2-foot layer of snow on the lower roof sections, supported by the extended eaves, provided excellent insulation without excessive weight. The key was keeping snow off the steeper main roof where the weight could be problematic, while encouraging it to accumulate on the shallower eave sections. The temperature differential he achieved was documented by the county surveyor, who visited in January 1892. Outside temperature 36 below zero, inside temperature 57 degrees, differential 93 degrees, with a fire described in the official report as minimal. The surveyor's report circulated widely. It provided scientific validation of what had seemed like a crazy idea just 2 years earlier. Universities in the East heard about the technique. In 1894, a professor from the University of Minnesota traveled to Bemidji to study the snow-insulated cabins. He took measurements, interviewed settlers, and documented the technique. He published a paper in 1895 titled Utilization of Snow as Thermal Insulation in Frontier Dwellings. The paper confirmed that snow insulation provided R values of R2 to R3 per inch, depending on snow density. A 5-foot snow barrier could provide an effective R value of 120 to 180. That's extraordinary insulation. The professor also noted the psychological benefits. Settlers in snow-insulated cabins reported less anxiety about fuel supplies. They didn't have the constant fear of running out of wood. They could relax, knowing their cabins would stay warm even if the fire went out. This mental comfort was as valuable as the physical warmth. Fear and stress take their own toll on health and survival. Lars's reputation grew. He became known as an expert in cold weather survival. Settlers planning to move to northern regions would seek him out for advice. He taught freely, explaining the principles, showing them how to build the containment structures, how to pack the snow, how to maintain proper ventilation. He never charged for his knowledge. He considered it a duty to share what his grandfather had taught him. In 1896, Lars married a widow named Anna Johansson, who had a small claim near his. They combined their lands and built a new, larger cabin designed from the ground up for snow insulation. The cabin had extended eaves all around, permanent snow containment structures, and a heavily reinforced roof. It was the most advanced snow-insulated dwelling in the region. The new cabin's performance was exceptional. In the cold winter of 1897 to 1898, Lars documented a maximum temperature differential of 104 degrees. Outside, 43 below zero, inside, 61 degrees, with a fire so small it would fit in a cooking pot. The cabin was comfortable enough that Anna grew herbs on the windowsill through the winter. The interior environment was stable and warm enough to support plant life. They raised 4 children in that cabin. The children grew up understanding snow as a tool, not just as something to play in. They learned to build snow barriers, to read snow density, to maintain the insulation through the winter. When they grew up and built their own homes, they incorporated the same techniques. The knowledge passed from generation to generation. The economic impact of snow insulation was significant. Firewood was labor. Hours of cutting, splitting, hauling, time spent gathering fuel was time not spent on other productive activities. Snow insulation reduced firewood requirements by 70 to 80%. That freed up enormous amounts of time. Time for hunting, trapping, improving the land, or simply resting. The efficiency gain was substantial. The environmental impact was also notable. Less firewood consumption meant less pressure on local forests. Areas where settlers used snow insulation showed less deforestation than regions where they didn't. The forests closer to settlements lasted longer. This became particularly important as settlements grew and more people needed wood. Efficiency reduced the overall impact. The health benefits were equally important. Constant exposure to cold, as experienced in poorly insulated cabins, stressed the body and weakened immune systems. Settlers in warm, stable environments were healthier. They suffered fewer respiratory illnesses, fewer cases of frostbite, better overall survival rates. The warmth provided by snow insulation wasn't luxury, it was a health intervention. Some settlers worried about snowmelt creating moisture problems. Lars addressed this by demonstrating proper drainage design. The containment structures had to drain away from the foundation. The air gap between snow and wall had to allow for moisture dissipation. The cabin had to breathe with proper ventilation to prevent condensation inside. When these features were incorporated, moisture problems were minimal. The technique wasn't without challenges. It required labor, shoveling snow after each storm to maintain the barriers. It required planning, building the containment structures before winter. It required understanding, knowing how to pack snow properly, how to maintain ventilation, how to prevent ice dams. But for those willing to learn, the benefits far outweighed the challenges. By the early 1900s, snow insulation was standard practice in northern Minnesota and parts of Wisconsin and Michigan. It had spread to the Dakotas and Montana. Anywhere that experienced severe cold and significant snowfall, settlers adopted the technique. It became part of the local building culture, passed from old-timers to newcomers as essential knowledge for surviving northern winters. The First World War interrupted development of the technique. Many young men left for Europe. Some never returned. But the knowledge persisted among those who stayed. During the Depression years of the 1930s, snow insulation became even more valuable. With money scarce and fuel expensive, the free insulation provided by snow helped families survive on almost nothing. Lars Eriksson lived until 1934. He died at age 76, highly respected in his community. At his funeral, over 200 people attended. They came from across 3 counties. They came to honor a man who'd brought ancient knowledge to the frontier, who'd been mocked and vindicated, who'd saved lives by understanding what snow could do. His cabin stood until 1958, 70 years after it was built. It was finally demolished when the land was sold for commercial development. But before demolition, the State Historical Society documented it thoroughly. Photographs, measurements, interviews with people who had lived in it. The documentation preserved the knowledge for future generations. The principle of snow insulation faded from common use as central heating became standard. By the 1960s, almost no one was building snow barriers around cabins. The technique seemed obsolete, a relic of pioneer hardship. Why insulate with snow when you had oil heat and electricity? The knowledge moved from practice to history, but the principle remained valid. Snow still insulates. It still traps air. It still provides R value. In recent years, as interest in sustainable living and emergency preparedness has grown, people have rediscovered snow insulation. Survivalists and off-grid enthusiasts have tested it. Their findings match Lars's observations from 1890. Snow works. It works spectacularly. Modern testing confirms that fluffy snow provides an R value of approximately R1 per inch. Denser snow provides less, around R0.5 per inch. 5 feet of fluffy snow provides an R value of about 60. That's equivalent to about 12 inches of modern fiberglass insulation or 6 inches of closed-cell foam, and it's free. It falls from the sky. The technique has applications beyond cabins. Modern preppers use snow insulation for emergency shelters. Quinzees, which are hollowed-out snow mounds, can provide life-saving shelter in survival situations. The snow walls, typically 2 to 3 feet thick, create an insulated space where body heat alone can raise the temperature to 30 or 40 degrees above outside air temperature. No fire needed. Military forces training for Arctic operations learn snow shelter techniques. Special forces, search and rescue teams, and winter mountaineers all study the principles Lars applied to his cabin. The U.S. Army's Cold Weather Manual includes detailed instructions on building snow shelters using the same physics Lars learned from his Sami grandfather. The cultural knowledge that Lars brought from Norway had deep roots. The Sami people had been using snow for shelter and insulation for thousands of years. Their traditional winter camps included structures called goati, which were wooden frames covered with layers of fabric and snow. The snow layer provided critical insulation in the extreme Arctic cold. Inuit peoples across the Arctic developed the igloo, perhaps the most elegant application of snow as a building material. An igloo, properly built, can maintain interior temperatures of 40 to 60 degrees above outside temperature using only body heat and oil lamps. The snow blocks cut from wind-compacted snow provide both structure and insulation. It's a complete dwelling made from frozen water. Lars's contribution was translating this indigenous knowledge into a form that American settlers could understand and apply. He didn't invent snow insulation, he adapted it. He took principles used in snow shelters and applied them to log cabins. He created a hybrid technique that combined European log building with Arctic snow knowledge. The result was more effective than either approach alone. The mockery Lars endured reflects a broader pattern in frontier history. Indigenous and traditional knowledge was often dismissed by European settlers as primitive or superstitious. Techniques that had sustained people for millennia were rejected in favor of familiar methods that often didn't suit the new environment. The settlers who thrived were usually those willing to learn from people who knew the land. Lars's willingness to listen to his grandfather, to value Sami knowledge, to apply techniques that seemed strange by Norwegian or American standards, that willingness saved his life and the lives of his neighbors. It's a lesson in humility and cross-cultural learning. The best knowledge often comes from unexpected sources. The wise person listens and learns. The 18-degree temperature difference mentioned in the title was a conservative estimate. Lars often achieved 20 or 30-degree differences. On extreme cold days, the differential could exceed 90 degrees, but even 18 degrees was transformative. 18 degrees was the difference between freezing and comfort, between fuel crisis and fuel security, between fear and confidence. Modern homesteaders in northern regions have rediscovered snow insulation. Some build structures specifically designed for it, super-insulated cabins with features to accommodate snow barriers. Others simply pile snow against existing structures during winter. Reports from these modern practitioners confirm the same results Lars documented: dramatic reduction in heating costs, more stable interior temperatures, improved comfort. The technique is particularly valuable in off-grid situations where fuel must be cut by hand or purchased at high cost. For people living without electricity, without natural gas, every unit of heat saved is labor saved. Snow insulation can reduce firewood requirements by half or more. That's the difference between spending every daylight hour cutting wood and having time for other activities. Subscribe to this channel to discover more forgotten knowledge that's more relevant today than ever. From frontier survival techniques to sustainable living wisdom, We explore the practical skills that kept people alive before modern technology. Don't miss the next story. Hit subscribe now. The environmental wisdom in Lars's technique deserves emphasis. He was working with natural cycles, not against them. He accepted that winter brought snow. Instead of fighting it, clearing it, treating it as an enemy, he used it. He partnered with winter. This ecological thinking, this working with nature rather than dominating it, produced better results with less effort. This approach contrasts sharply with modern attitudes toward winter. We fight snow. We melt it with salt. We remove it with machines. We pump heat into buildings to overcome it. We treat winter as a problem to be solved with technology and energy. Lars treated winter as a resource to be utilized. His approach was more efficient and more sustainable. The social dynamics of the story are instructive. Lars was an outsider, an immigrant, practicing techniques foreign to his neighbors. Their initial reaction was mockery and dismissal. But when his method proved superior, the community shifted. Not everyone. Some remained skeptical. But enough people were willing to learn that the technique spread. The community's ability to recognize and adopt better methods allowed them to thrive. Lars's generosity in teaching was crucial. He could have kept his knowledge secret, maintaining an advantage. Instead, he taught freely. He helped neighbors who'd mocked him. He gave firewood to families in crisis. This generosity built community cohesion. It created networks of mutual support that helped everyone survive. In harsh environments, cooperation beats competition. The legacy of Lars Eriksson's snow cabin extends beyond the specific technique. It's a story about questioning assumptions, about being willing to look foolish in pursuit of what you believe is right, about valuing knowledge from unexpected sources, about persistence in the face of ridicule. These lessons apply far beyond building cabins in Minnesota. How many times do we dismiss ideas because they seem strange? How often do we stick with familiar methods even when better alternatives exist? How frequently do we value appearance over function? The neighbors who laughed at Lars valued conventional wisdom over experimental knowledge. They paid for that choice in cold and suffering. Lars valued effectiveness over appearance. He didn't care that his cabin looked strange. He cared that it stayed warm. This prioritization, function over form, is a mark of practical wisdom. In survival situations, what works matters infinitely more than what looks right. The prettiest cabin in the settlement is worthless if it can't keep you warm. The physics of snow insulation are straightforward, but often misunderstood. People assume snow is cold, therefore it makes things colder. But cold isn't a substance. Cold is the absence of heat. Snow doesn't add coldness to a cabin. It prevents heat from escaping. By slowing heat transfer, it allows the cabin to retain warmth generated inside. The key is the air trapped in snow. Air itself is an excellent insulator. It's used in modern insulation materials for this reason. Fiberglass insulation works by trapping air in tiny glass fibers. Foam insulation works by creating bubbles of trapped air. Snow works the same way. Ice crystals create structure. Air fills the spaces. Heat moves slowly through this matrix. The density of snow determines its insulating value. Fluffy, fresh snow with lots of air has high R value. Dense, compacted snow with less air has lower R value. Ice with almost no trapped air has very low R value. This is why Lars was careful not to overcompress his snow barriers. He wanted them firm enough to stay in place, but fluffy enough to trap maximum air. Moisture management was critical to Lars's success. Snow melts. Meltwater had to be channeled away from the cabin foundation. His drainage system, with its air gap and runoff channels, prevented water from pooling against the logs. This prevented rot and structural damage. Without proper drainage, snow insulation could indeed cause problems. With it, the system worked beautifully. Ventilation was equally important. A super-insulated cabin can trap moisture from breathing, cooking, and other activities. Without ventilation, this moisture condenses on cold surfaces, causing problems. Lars's cabin had small vents near the roof peak that could be opened or closed as needed. This allowed moisture to escape while retaining heat. Proper ventilation made the system sustainable. The temperature stability provided by snow insulation had benefits beyond comfort. In a cabin where temperature swings wildly, food storage is difficult. Water freezes and thaws repeatedly. In Lars's stable environment, food kept better. Water stayed liquid in barrels. Seeds stored for spring planting remained viable. The stable temperature protected possessions and supplies. The technique's applicability extends to modern situations. During power outages in winter, snow insulation could prevent frozen pipes and maintain livable temperatures. For emergency shelters, temporary structures, or disaster relief, snow barriers could provide quick, effective insulation using available materials. The knowledge isn't obsolete. It's ready to use whenever needed. Lars Eriksson's story is ultimately about observation and learning. He observed how cold moved through his cabin. He learned from his grandfather's traditional knowledge. He experimented with applications. He documented results. He refined his technique. He shared what he learned. This process, observation to experiment, to documentation, to sharing, is the foundation of all practical knowledge. The modern world has largely forgotten how to observe nature this closely. We rely on technology, on purchase solutions, on expert systems. We've outsourced survival to infrastructure. When that infrastructure fails, we're vulnerable. Lars and his neighbors lived without that infrastructure. They had to understand their environment intimately. Their lives depended on it. That intimate knowledge, that deep observation, is what's missing today. We know how to program thermostats, but not how heat moves through walls. We know how to call repair services, but not how to diagnose problems. We've traded hands-on knowledge for convenient ignorance. Lars would have considered this trade a bad deal. Knowledge can't break down. It can't run out of power. It can't fail you. The winters of northern Minnesota are still brutal. Temperatures still drop to 40 below. Snow still falls in massive quantities. But modern buildings with central heat and grid power handle it easily. As long as the power stays on, as long as the furnace works, as long as the fuel deliveries continue. When those systems fail, people rediscover how cold their homes actually are without mechanical heating. Lars's cabin stayed warm with almost no mechanical systems, no electricity, no furnace, no fuel deliveries, just snow and a tiny fire. That resilience, that independence from infrastructure, gave him security his neighbors lacked. When fuel ran short, when supplies failed, his cabin kept working. It was designed to work with available materials and natural processes. That design philosophy created true security. The neighbors laughed when he covered his cabin in snow. They saw a man burying his house. They saw foolishness. They couldn't imagine that what looked insane was actually brilliant. Their laughter turned to wonder when his cabin stayed 18 degrees warmer inside, when he had firewood to spare while they burned furniture, when he sat comfortably while they shivered. Sometimes the person everyone laughs at is the only one who sees clearly. Sometimes the technique that looks ridiculous works better than conventional methods. Sometimes ancient knowledge is more valuable than modern assumptions. Lars Eriksson proved all of this. His snow-covered cabin, mocked and misunderstood, was warmer, more efficient, and more resilient than every conventional cabin in the settlement. The knowledge came from the Sami people, from centuries of Arctic survival, from understanding snow as a resource rather than an obstacle. Lars brought that knowledge to Minnesota. He adapted it to log cabin construction. He demonstrated it to skeptical neighbors. He shared it freely. And in doing so, he changed how people survived winter in the northern frontier. His cabin is gone, but the knowledge persists. Snow still insulates. Air still resists heat transfer. Physics hasn't changed. The technique works today exactly as it did in 1890. The only difference is whether we're willing to use it, whether we can overcome our assumptions about snow being the enemy, whether we can learn from traditions we might otherwise dismiss. Lars Eriksson was willing. He learned. He applied what he learned. He survived in comfort while others struggled. And when they finally understood what he'd done, he taught them. Not with arrogance, but with patience and generosity. The man they called Snowmad turned out to be the wisest person in the settlement. The cabin they mocked turned out to be the warmest, and the knowledge they dismissed turned out to be salvation. The neighbors laughed when he covered his cabin in snow until it stayed 18 degrees warmer inside, until he had firewood to spare, until they understood that sometimes the old ways are the best ways, that sometimes the fool is the only wise man, and that sometimes survival depends on being willing to look ridiculous in pursuit of what actually works.